Hello and welcome to this webinar on how next generation science resources support mastery of the Maine science standards. We're going to get started here just in a moment. I have a few more folks signing in, but to give you a little background on myself, I'm Francis Vigent. I'm a high school math teacher turned STEM specialist for almost 8 years at the elementary and middle school level, all in public education. And my job today is as CEO of NOADM. We are headquartered here in Massachusetts, just a bit north of Boston in the city of Salem. And we work with schools and districts all over Northeast, West Coast, even internationally. And to kind of frame a little bit about ourselves and our role sort of in the classroom, it's really to think a bit about why STEM. Why does STEM matter? So STEM being science, technology, engineering, and math. Only 4% of students nationally will go on to graduate high school and essentially get a STEM degree, some sort of 4-year diploma in a science, computer science, physics, or anything like this. So it's a very small number. And that begs the question, why should 100% of students learn STEM if only 4% will ever get a degree? And the reason is that science, technology, engineering, and math is the perfect venue for teaching higher order thinking skills, specifically creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills. And so as you see the next generation science standards emerging, or they have emerged, and as you're seeing them sort of emerge in districts and in classrooms, they're really a great opportunity to teach these higher order thinking skills, and that's really where the focus is. And in order to make that possible, the classroom environment is more and more becoming skills oriented. So the idea of using skills or developing skills and using those skills to access content and develop the content as students. And so that means that students are really playing the role of scientist and engineer in the classroom under the newer standards that are emerging nationally. And so the classroom really has an interesting challenge, because in order to put students into the role of scientist and engineer requires curriculum, it requires hands-on materials, professional development, and these sort of things. And that's basically where NOADM fits in at the very, very end, to be able to help educators and schools connect up and deliver effective STEM instruction. So nonetheless, just to give you a quick overview, what we're going to do is we have about an hour, and we are going to basically start this conversation about how the next generation science standards and resources support mastery of Maine science standards by spending about 45 minutes taking a look at what makes the next generation science standards a bit sort of tougher, how they're defined a bit differently, how they link to Common Core ELA and math, and how these new standards, and really it's a new approach to standards, shape the methods or pedagogy for science instruction K-12, and how that links not only to ELA and math, but also art. If you are coming into this session already, since you're here on the live session, and you have questions, burning questions, feel free on the right side of your screen. There's a little question box. You can type in there, send them over. I'll do the best I can to get to all of them or try to address them within the webinar if I can, if they fit. If we don't get to your question, feel free at the end to give my email address as well as some contact information for other folks here at NOADM. You can email or even call. So without further ado, we're going to jump in here and take a good look. So starting again with next generation science standards, sort of that construction, some parallels with Maine, and then I want to save about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A and talk a bit more specifically, kind of compare and contrast maybe with what you're seeing in Maine and specific questions you may have. So Maine was a next generation lead state in the development of the next generation science standards, And a few months ago, there was a bill put forward that would have really formally adopted next generation science standards statewide, and unfortunately Governor Paul LePage vetoed the bill, and the reasons cited were kind of a combination of money and politics, and this isn't to take a side on the issue at all. It's just simply to say that they were put forward for adoption, they were vetoed just based on the governor's view of money, and also some of the other pieces that have been on the table with Common Core, new teacher evaluation, new assessments. But that said, more than half of Maine school districts or schools are adopting NGSS in some form, and this is discussed actually in the Portland Herald Press. It was probably about 3 months ago or so that it kind of all played out. But eventually, the bottom line is that, and this was backed up by the Maine Science, Technology, Engineering, and Math Council, what you're going to see as we go through this webinar is that the next generation science standards are a better defined, and the Maine STEM Council called the standards superior. I don't know that superior is the right term, but what they said is the new standards place a stronger emphasis on engineering, using the scientific method to solve problems, and they put communities in a position that's more likely to foster job growth. So they're really workforce development oriented standards, and I would strongly agree with what the Maine STEM Council has said. These standards are more scientific, they're more defined, and you're going to see that it's not only referring to content, but it's actually helping define what the content is, what the practices are, and what the concepts are. So I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but it's important to kind of look at this twofold. Maine's current standards are sort of, they're a benchmark. They're the minimum of what you have to do, but again, they're left open-ended because the hope is that as you sort of meet the performance expectations of the existing standards, that you're really filling those out to the best of your ability, and so you can actually use the next generation science standards to do that. Okay, so moving on. The next generation science standards are really built on the work of the National Research Council, the National Academies of Science and Engineering, the National Institutes of Health. And so while they're not national standards, they are kind of quasi-national because 26 partner states came together. Maine was one of them. What the whole process started with is really a look at what science and engineering is and how it's taught in schools traditionally. And what sort of emerged was that schools, by and large, teach about science and sometimes engineering, but they don't traditionally teach it. They don't teach how to be a scientist or how to be an engineer. They don't teach the practices. And so with that sort of early realization going all the way back to like 2008, 2009, it sort of launched this process that then evolved into the next generation science standards that were finalized in 2013. Within the standards, it reflects what the National Research Council believes, what scientists and engineers believe. Science, and defines science as knowledge from experimentation. So scientists answer questions by developing a hypothesis and testing that hypothesis using an experiment, gathering data, and then using that data to support a claim about the validity of the hypothesis. That gives us scientific knowledge. So that's why what you see on your screen is a kind of STEM cycle. So science yields scientific knowledge. Engineers use their scientific knowledge to solve problems. So engineers use the engineering design process to look at a problem, research it, pull their scientific knowledge in, and then create prototypes of solutions that may solve that problem, and then they test them. The tests mimic sort of real life circumstances and yield data that allows the engineer to look at the prototype and say whether or not it solves the problem. And so when a prototype solves a problem, it's technology. And so engineers produce technology to solve problems. And in education, oftentimes, the word technology is misused. In education, oftentimes we refer to technology as things that are electronic, computers, overhead projectors, things like this, LCD projectors. But in reality, most technology is not electronic at all. Technology, it can be a doorstop, a door itself, a doorknob, a lock, a table, a glass jar, a plastic jar. All these things are technology because they solve problems. It forms a STEM cycle because that technology then allows scientists to ask new questions or to answer questions that they couldn't answer before. So for instance, right now there's a probe orbiting Pluto, and it's able to answer questions for scientists, because without that technology, scientists may have questions that we just simply don't have access to the data. We can't actually experiment, gather data to test any hypotheses about Pluto. So that technology of the probe and orbiting Pluto is a technology that's enabling science, that's going to extend scientific knowledge. And who knows, maybe that scientific knowledge will yield new technology, depending on what it is. And just think about the probes of tomorrow that are able to go out and maybe gather different data or deeper data about Pluto. So this is a STEM cycle, sort of a connection between disciplines, but it's also a cycle of innovation. The faster that you kind of go around, the faster you innovate. And there are certainly shortcuts. There are times when engineers design glass bottles to solve the problem of carrying or preserving milk, and then maybe plastic bottles are found to be somehow superior for durability or something like that. So there's little iterations, but it requires that knowledge of plastic, which came after glass. Math, the role of math is as a tool for communication. And so math allows scientists and engineers to quantify observations. So there are quantitative data sources and qualitative data sources. Things that are qualitative are things like yellowish blue or bubbly or light. Quantitative observations are things like 10 centimeters or 15 milliliters, so on and so forth. Things that are very specific and standardized. So math allows scientists and engineers to capture those observations, but also allows them, or gives them the tools really, to analyze and evaluate those observations and really boil it down. So as in a very concrete sense, if you had two groups of plants and one was being treated with a plant food, and you are comparing the growth rates, math allows you to actually capture those observations, those measurements. Maybe you have multiple plants, so again, you're going to take an average, so math allows you to do that analysis and maybe look at the difference of the average to determine whether your hypothesis about the effect of plant food is supported or not supported by the data. So this foundation, this idea of what science is knowledge from experimentation, that scientists ask questions and answer them through the use of hypotheses and hypotheses testing, and the role of engineers, problem solving, and using the engineering design process. It's something that's very well defined and also unique in the next generation science standards. Within the existing Maine standards, without, again, getting too far into things, the trappings are there, but it's not as well defined. And I would say that the big gap is in practices, and we're going to take a look at those practices in a second. A way to think of practices is essentially a practice is the sort of pieces of a process, not steps, but sort of the pieces. So in an ELA context, there are writing practices like voice, word choice, sentence structure, and there are also writing processes like pre-writing, revising, peer reviewing, publishing. So the practices sort of come together to form the process. Science and engineering have their own unique processes, but the practices are common. And in the existing Maine standards, none of these are particularly well defined. They're kind of lumped together and around sort of inquiry and distributed among the unifying themes. So we'll take a little closer look at that later. This is a screenshot from the next generation science standards. So what you see here is at the top in this white box is a performance expectation. So the next generation science standards are not standards in the sense of students are expected to be able to identify a rock or identify something that's organic or inorganic, or to be able to distinguish between sedimentary, igneous, and metamorphic rock, or to know something specific. The next generation science standards are basically a bunch of expectations of what a student will be able to demonstrate as a result of what they've learned in the classroom. So here you see that a student will be who has reached at least proficiency should be able to demonstrate understanding in the following form: developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. So within this performance expectation, a student should be able to essentially look at a context that's relevant and be able to describe through food chains and food webs how energy and matter are moving from plants to animals to decomposers and so on. The way that the next generation science standards try to help define that context is using what's called the 3 dimensions, and that's what you see in these 3 colored boxes below. And before I explain further about that, the 3 dimensions are very sort of a specific way of unpacking what you know as the unifying themes and the skills of scientific inquiry and the technological design process. So it's been broken out, and as we go through, you'll see this first box in blue. The science and engineering practices are skills specific to the discipline of science and engineering. So scientists and engineers, you can see here just in this example, need to be able to develop, and that's key, develop and use models. So not only use something someone else has given them. So that's a skill. Disciplinary core ideas are sort of the content or sort of the fact base. So you would think of this, disciplinary core ideas are life science, earth science, physical science. However, the disciplinary core ideas that have been identified in the next generation science standards are all connected. So you don't have, within a disciplinary core idea, you won't find things like identify sedimentary rock or identify igneous rock or distinguish between a solid and liquid. What they're looking for, and you can see right here in the first sentence, the food of almost any kind of animal can be traced back to plants. They're looking for students to understand that a food source is actually connected from sort of consumers or from producers to consumers and on down through the food chain. So the content actually has a relationship to other content, and that's key in the disciplinary core ideas. I would say that definition of disciplinary core ideas is lacking in the Maine standards. The Maine standards hint at what the content is, but it's almost like the Maine standards create a content bucket, which then you have to kind of fill out and further define. What's happening with these disciplinary core ideas is that there's a lot of definition, but again, you can bring more to it. It's just that you understand as a result of the disciplinary core idea sort of the boundaries or context that the standard is applied in. The third dimension, which you see on the right in green, is cross-cutting concepts. So a cross-cutting concept is essentially how the content or the concept behaves, and behaves in terms of a system. So in this case here, developing a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers, and the environment. These are all different parts of a food chain or food web that are transferring matter. And so you could describe that as a system of components and how those components interact. So a component would be the grass, and then another component would be the deer, and then another component would be the wolf. And you could think of all those components in terms of a food chain. And then if we brought in other, predators or producers, we could think of that as a food web. So that is actually a cross-cutting concept that's related to that disciplinary core idea. So what's really great about these standards, and I think why the Maine Science, Technology, and Engineering Council kind of calls them superior, is that when you view these three dimensions, you can create a context in the classroom by which a student can develop an understanding, they can develop the skills, so these science and engineering practices, and use those skills to access the disciplinary core ideas and cross-cutting concepts and actually bring their own ideas forward and make connections between different concepts and sort of be nurtured over time. And that's something that can be done under the current standards. It's just that it really puts an awful lot on individual educators and small teams to pull it all together. And so if you're adopting the next generation science standards, you can address the current Maine standards, but in a way that actually exceeds what's required. But that's in some ways easier because it's been articulated for you. But let's look at a little closer at those STEM practices. So a STEM practice, like I said earlier, is a skill specific to the discipline of science and or engineering. Look at these practices from the student's perspective, and again, they emanate from the National Research Council all the way back to 2012 when they were published, but they are that foundation, first dimension in the next generation science standards. So a student needs to be able to ask questions in a scientific context and define problems in an engineering context. Not only be able to use a model, but develop it. So developing a model is, again, thinking back to the food chain, food web. If a student is given a context of, why is it when the wolves disappeared that the deer, all the grass went away, when we know that deer eat grass. A student needs to be able to sort of develop a model that talks about, kind of the food chain and those pieces. What happens when the predator goes away? Then the prey becomes overpopulated. The overpopulation causes a demand for grass that causes the grass to sort of disappear, or the different other plants that the deer would be eating. So students need to be able to think this way. So it's really a way of thinking. Not only carrying out an investigation, so it's not uncommon for, elementary, middle school, high school, doesn't matter. It's not uncommon for students to be given procedures or sort of shown something that they are then expected to do. Essentially, something's modeled and they repeat it, or something's demonstrated and they remember it. Students are expected to be able to plan investigations. So developing that skill of how do I go from this question or go from this problem to a solution or to a hypothesis that's been tested and data's been gathered about it. They need to be able to actually develop the plan, then carry the plan out. Not only interpreting data, but analyzing it. Computational and mathematical thinking really has to do with I guess a way to think about this is what data needs to be gathered, what analysis do I need to do. If my data comes back and I compare it to the data of my peers, am I an outlier? If I'm an outlier, is my data correct or is it incorrect? And that just because someone's data is an outlier doesn't mean that it's incorrect. But it requires computational thinking to look for sources of human error and things like this in the class. Constructing explanations in science and designing solutions in engineering. These are conclusions, data-based conclusions. So as a result of the scientific process or the engineering design process, students need to be able to reflect back on their prototype or reflect back on their hypothesis using data that they collected to support a claim about that hypothesis or about that prototype. So think about the prototype. Should it be scaled up? Did it solve the problem? What evidence, what specific evidence is part of supporting that claim? Engaging in argument from evidence. This is not a nasty argument, but a professional type argument where students really sort of in the classroom environment are taking what they've done as an individual or as a group of two and comparing that to their peers and arguing their point from the data and thinking really through what they've done and the results they've gotten to understand sources of variation, sources of error, and also just basically different angles on the same sort of problem, basically. Obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information is sort of infused throughout here, but again, it's that process of carrying out the plan. What does that look like in the classroom? Here's a couple of 4th, 5th grade level students. What they're doing is they are in the role of engineer. So the way we approach the next generation science standards through curriculum is to create a classroom environment where the students can be scientists and engineers. The way that you do that is to start with nonfiction reading that helps give every student common background about the context that they're going to be dealing with. So vocabulary, orienting the students to the context. Then you have a Socratic dialogue where that context comes to life in your community. So if you're talking about things related to rocks and minerals, what are the landforms and rocks and minerals that are in your community that you see every day, whether it's coastal or in the hills or around a lake, and connecting also not just to the community but also to the students' individual experiences. So maybe some students have been to Mount Rushmore or a quarry, that sort of a thing. At some point, that Socratic dialogue turns to a problem or question which students will be able to solve hands-on in the class. And so that's where these two students are at. They are acting here as engineers. They're using, you see lab notebooks here, and what they're doing is they're working from a large problem, taking the problem apart. They are pulling facts from what they read, from what they discussed in class, and together they're trying to brainstorm solutions to that problem given the material resources they have available. And then what they're going to do is they're going to diagram that prototype. They're going to test it under sort of circumstances that would mimic sort of large-scale use. They're going to collect data, and then they're going to reflect back on the prototype that they decided on and designed and created. And now their prototype is going to be different than all the other peers. Within their group, they're agreeing, but other groups in the class may have completely different approaches, and that's fine. That's what you want. Again, it's not about showing the students something and having them repeat it so that you have 10 or 15 or 35 kids all sort of doing the same thing, producing the same thing as if it's, making toys. What you're doing is you're trying to challenge them as scientists and engineers to bring their ideas to life and to use those practice skills to access the content they read about that they discussed and actually try to extend it. And so whether it's engineering or science, it's that same sort of methodology. What's great about this approach is that within the context of science, you're actually achieving applied Common Core ELA standards and technical, specifically their technical ELA standards, and also applied math. And that we would think about that as the Common Core math practices. And so we'll take a look at those in a second. But what's common to everything is that we're we're showing the students that science does not only live in science time, but actually science is an application of math and of ELA and vice versa, that ELA is relevant to science and math is relevant to science, and we're sharpening the students' creative, evaluative, and analytical thinking skills in all of these disciplines. And we could put art in here as well, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So without spending too much time, the part that is really only science or only engineering is the experimenting and prototyping. Otherwise, students are generating nonfiction text as they're creating those plans. They're doing nonfiction reading, so that's all ELA, and then graphing, collecting data, and so on and so forth within a math context. Something that's important to think about here is really these new standards rearrange Bloom's taxonomy a bit. Bloom's taxonomy is sort of a way of ranking higher order thinking skills. You've probably heard of it forever and ever. Normally it's sort of 6 levels: remembering, understanding, applying, analyzing, evaluating, creating. If you've been teaching for a real long time, you may remember a 7th step in there somewhere. The thing is that creating, evaluating, and analyzing happens simultaneously with the next generation science standards. If you picture those 2 students working in the classroom where they've been released with responsibility to go from that question or go from that problem and make a plan, carry the plan out, gather the data, generate a conclusion, and then report back, and as peers sort of consider all these reports and compare them, that is creating, that's evaluating, that's analyzing all at the same time. Creating the plan, carrying the plan out, evaluating what's been carried out, analyzing it, and obviously that's an application of what they understand and remember as well. So really key difference. It's not isolated, sort of siloed, you know, we're going to create now and then analyze later. It's not like that at all. Just a quick look at these. Common Core ELA technical subject standards. These ones I pulled from the middle school level, so grade 6 through 8. But you can see how by adopting next generation science resources and that approach in the classroom, you're not only addressing at a very deep level science needs and the science standards, but you're addressing Common Core ELA. Common Core ELA standards require students to be able to cite textual evidence to support analysis of science, to be able to summarize text distinct from prior knowledge. And this shocks people a lot of times. Following precisely a multi-step procedure is actually an ELA standard, not a science standard. So they're doing that when they've created a procedure and then carry it out. However, most times, again, in traditional environments where students are given a procedure, they're not really doing science. Again, they're doing ELA. Expressing information visually, so not only the data they collect, but how they render that data in a graph or a table is ELA. Distinguishing among facts, reason, judgment, and research findings or speculation. When those students debrief, they bring that conclusion forward, they're considering whether or not that's what their peers are saying is actually data-based. So they're going to use their own judgment, but they're going to also look at the judgment of their peers to kind of figure out, is this fact, opinion, speculation, or so on. Common Core math practices are very closely related to the science and engineering practices. And you'll see that here, particularly where I bolded the Common Core math practices. It's going to happen in this environment with science or within sort of STEM with next generation science standards. Making sense of problems, persevering in solving them, reasoning abstractly, right? If you are creating a plan, before you carry that plan out, whether it's science or engineering, you're reasoning abstractly and quantitatively. To create the plan after you've carried out an investigation it's just journaling. There's no abstract reasoning. It's considered a double entry lab. So under no standards should you be doing that, but under the next generation science standards, through what I've described, you're carrying out a math practice within the context of science. Modeling with mathematics, so The data that you're collecting has to be able to be useful in evaluating your solution or your prototype. Using appropriate tools strategically. A tool is not just a hammer or a saw. A tool is in operation, a mean, median, mode. It is the scientific process, which is different than the engineering process, being able to pick which one you use. Attending to precision. It's not just adding stuff to a mixture or adding more. It's 10 grams to an empty plastic cup. And making use of structure is making use of that process, but also within a procedure, if you think about the different steps in the procedure, that's an actual logical structure that you're creating in the scientific context that's achieving a goal here with a math practice. And then the last piece, expressing regularity and repeated reasoning. Think about this as the old writing assignment that I think everybody gets at some point in their life, a process writing assignment to write the procedure for making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Inevitably, when students are given that writing assignment, they come back with something like a 50 or 100-step procedure, which doesn't really result in a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but nonetheless, it tends to be very, very detailed and lengthy. Looking for and expressing regularity and repeated reasoning is looking for recursive steps. It's looking for ways to be efficient. If I structure my procedure this way, I can say to repeat steps 1 and 2 for 4 more trials, and then repeat steps 1 through 3 with corn instead of rice. And so thereby maybe taking a 20-step procedure and reducing it down to 5 steps or 4 steps. So that's a way that this happens in science to address a goal of a Common Core math practice. So what is effective STEM instruction? So this is sort of the golden question, I guess, here. The old Maine definition is instruction should support students in asking questions and making inquiries to help them understand and solve problems that require the integration of knowledge and processes in authentic contexts. So what we've been talking about is all sort of contextualized learning. It's an authentic context. It's getting students working hands-on. But the new definition of STEM instruction that comes from the National Research Council takes it a couple steps further, and the language is very intentional here. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on students' early interest and experiences, identifies and builds on what they know, so it's intentionally nurturing, and provides them with experiences to engage them in the practices, so those are the skills specific to the discipline, of science and sustain their interest. So the pacing is not just 3 units a year, it's much more regular, it's monthly units. And what you see down here in these pictures is really the shift. It's not the teacher sort of pre-teaching, modeling something that then the kids all kind of go back and repeat, but rather those 2 kids that we showed earlier and sort of talked about being charged with a mission of solving a problem or a question using the practices of science and engineering to get at the content, to bring their idea to life, to engage them in actually developing an idea and engaging them, sustaining their interest that way. As you think about the different kinds of resources you're developing or assessing, if you're thinking of something commercially, think about different readiness levels. So there are different readiness levels in terms of what's expected in the classroom, but also what's expected of resources. So awareness readiness is, think of museums. If you take a trip to a museum and a student goes and learns about scientists or engineers, and they can tell you what a scientist is or what an engineer is, they're aware. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're prepared with the skills to be a scientist or engineer. Another way to maybe think of it is if they go to the museum and they see the electrical demonstration, it doesn't mean they're ready to wire the house or to build circuits, but they're aware maybe of some of the basics. Knowledge readiness is something that we get from textbooks. So textbooks prepare students by telling them all about what scientists and engineers have done, what they've accomplished. But it's not forward-looking. It's not putting them in the role or building skills that allow them to be scientists and engineers. Taking a step further, performance readiness is something where you see like an STC kit or a FOSS kit where students learn to perform specific tasks to answer specific questions. So for instance, how do I find out how hard a rock or mineral is? I perform a hardness test. If I'm asked that question, I'll take the rock or mineral and I'll scratch it on different surfaces to discover how hard it is. So it's sort of a one-to-one relationship. Mastery readiness, and all of these things apply to the current standards in Maine, regardless of whether you're thinking about next generation or not. Mastery readiness is about preparing students with the skills so that they can approach any problem or question methodically. So back to this sort of hardness question, mastery readiness would sort of look at it in context and would be skills to apply in a context. So if a contractor is building a kitchen and they need a durable countertop and there are different building materials to choose from, then a student who's at a mastery level, mastery ready, would look at that problem and be able to take it apart and say, okay, well, what is durability to start with? Does it have to do with fracturing? Does it have to do with scratching? Does it have to do with melting or freezing? Thinking about durability, then it's, well, how do I gather data to kind of understand which material is most durable, then gather that data, then reflect back on which material is actually most durable by the definition and by the data I collected. So that's mastery readiness, and that's really, I think, truly, even under the current Maine standards, when we talk about the skills of scientific inquiry and the technological design process, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about having those skills and being able to apply them in any context. What is involved in that? First of all, curriculum that is grade level specific and also really intentionally nurturing students from September through June. Second of all, from a professional development standpoint, really how are we taking that curriculum and acting as a facilitator, but not, and facilitator is probably not the right word there. How are we helping to facilitate an environment where students have a full release of responsibility? They're developing the skills, they're practicing the skills, and they're accessing the content using the skills. And then, of course, what materials are necessary to be able to do that hands-on. And that all sort of should be articulated in such a way that, it's nurturing students from September through June, but from pre-K through 8th grade, and allowing that sort of paired small group environment in the classroom with full release of responsibility. And just by the way, when you look at these materials on the right, I mean, that's materials for, if you were a class of 25, probably 2, maybe 3 classes for a year. So to sort of keep a pace that engages student interest and also covers all the different content areas and puts them in that role on a regular basis. It does take material to do that. We mentioned, and I'm basically done here, I'm going to take some questions. So if you're thinking of questions, you can start, kind of pumping those in, and I'll take a look at those in a second. We mentioned STEAM, science, technology, engineering, art, and math. So when we talked about STEM, we said that the reason for STEM is really critical thinking skills, those higher order thinking skills of create, evaluate, and analyze that are useful in being a salesperson, in being a plumber, in being a contractor, or being a scientist. And in fact, science and engineering practices and those higher order thinking skills are very useful tools for communication. And art, oftentimes when we talk about STEAM or talk about art, people kind of get in a rut focusing on the aesthetics. We think that art is really about aesthetics. And in reality, art is engineered communication. And so when you think about those higher order thinking skills, create, evaluate, analyze, they're preparing students to be better creators of art and better consumers of art because they're being prepared to communicate better and also to understand communication better. The picture that you see on your screen is Pablo Picasso's Guernica, and to just give you a quick background, I personally don't find this aesthetically pleasing, but it's considered his most famous work. It's a oil on canvas that talks about the atrocities committed by fascists in the town of Guernica in Spain. And it is engineered communication. When the fascists discovered that Pablo Picasso had created this work of art and he was living in exile, they said to him, "What did you do?" And his response was, "I didn't do it, you did." And just in that statement, you can see that he was very clearly speaking through his art. He was communicating something to a specific group of people at a very specific point in time about a very specific event or series of events. And you can see that this art is not about aesthetics. It's about the atrocities of the fascists and what was happening to the people and to the animals and to the place that he really loved dearly. And so when you think about the impact of STEM skills on students' ELA skills, so English language arts, their ability to communicate in written form, or whether it's oil on canvas or in music or elsewhere, we're really training students to think deeply on both sides as creators as well as consumers. So what does this look like in a tangible sense? And I'm just going to click through some quick data, and then I have some questions here to answer. So on NECAP assessments in the state of New Hampshire, going all the way back to 2008, 2009, we were seeing schools that were getting anywhere from 10 to 30% above state average scores on their NECAP assessments. And the reason that we were seeing this was that students were able to perform in those inquiry portions as well as the non-inquiry sort of multiple choice portions of their test, because they weren't sort of trying to find a blank to fill. They were really considering and able to take apart what was being asked of them and to really consider the scenario, but then also as new information was introduced to understand somebody else's point of view. Really key. And you can see that when you look at the sub-levels here, sorry, the subsections. So in purple and in yellow are the school students, and the pink and the light blue is the state averages. And you can see in the inquiry section, the students really outperformed the state, especially in 2009. And in fact, this school became #1 in the state of New Hampshire. And according to NECAP assessments, which is a different, sorry, not NECAP, but the NEAP assessments, the national ones, New Hampshire's #1 in the United States. So these students were really pretty top, and these skills or practices have a real impact. And so the way that we were able to get to this point, even prior to the Next Generation Science Standards being released, was that we were really following all of the early sort of publications and documentation, sort of implementing what was being asked because it was a good idea, not really because it had become legislation yet. And so we saw these kinds of changes. In Massachusetts, which is not a NECAP state, they have their own Massachusetts Common Assessment Program. We've seen in urban environments like Lynn, Massachusetts, where students have gone in the course of 2.5 years from 36% advanced and proficient to 87% advanced and proficient, which is more than 50% above the state average. And in this particular case, the Lincoln Thompson Elementary School, this is 70% free and reduced lunch, over 50% English language learners. So making something hands-on, giving students an opportunity to engage outside of something that's purely text is not only makes sense from an engagement standpoint because it's actually fun, but it transcends language in a way that students begin to acquire new words and still access content without being bogged down by a textbook. So that was an urban environment. Again, city, probably 120,000 people. Even that's a UN High Council on Refugees relocation city as well. In a very affluent suburb, same state, we still see similar gains and similar levels of achievement, basically because kids are kids, and also because once they've gotten these practices, these skills, and understand the processes, they're really empowered to be able to approach problems and questions. So that's why we see students going from in the 50s to up in the 80s. Why does it plateau at 80? Basically because at that point, students have to be spot on. And that's really That's really it. And those all the low-hanging fruit is gone. It's really all about being spot on, especially in those sort of inquiry or open response sections. Okay, so went a little bit longer than I had hoped, but I'm going to grab questions now. I have a few here. My contact information is here. Mary Ellen's contact information is here. And I just want to point out before I start answering these questions, since I'll stick around if you need to leave, that we'll be following up probably tomorrow with a link to a recording of this webinar. This is really just sort of a high-level overview, but we're always happy to talk further. We have several other webinars as well. There's one on Friday if you are interested. There's a link to it here. And it's really about strategically implementing the next generation science standards. Specifically, what we're going to cover there is standards alignment, what NGSS inquiry resources look like, redefining student-teacher roles, milestones for release of responsibility, performance data targets, and closing loops of communication. We also have another webinar which we'll follow up with, which walks you through what a lesson looks like. So if you're wondering really how that plays out. Okay, so actually I'll leave that for you. Now I'm going to run through some questions. So just give me one moment. Okay, so somebody says they're wondering how to introduce new vocabulary and content as they create relationships. So the thing is that content and vocabulary, the way that we go about it is we do it through nonfiction reading and Socratic dialogue. So nonfiction reading, good nonfiction reading, and I like to think of what we do as, as a great exemplar of that, is written as a narrative. It's not paragraphs that explain words. That's how typical textbooks are written. What you really want is something that's written as a narrative, like almost like a newspaper article that explains a big idea and uses those vocabulary words and concepts and context. And then the relationships that you're creating in dialogue, it's not really that you're creating those relationships, it's that you're asking questions that help the students to create those relationships. So thinking about something like, you know, a rock or mineral, if you've read about this in context in a nonfiction piece, the Socratic dialogue becomes about, you know, what are the characteristics of the kinds of rocks that we have here where we live? And then see what the students come up with, and then begin connecting that to where we've seen rocks and minerals that are very different from where we live, and what are those characteristics. And very quickly, the content and the context comes to life, and you can move to, you know, other areas as well, connecting to things that you've previously learned, as well as foreshadowing what you will be learning. Another question in here. And if I'm not answering your question, feel free to throw in another one if I can get to it, and I'll clarify. Somebody asked another question around, is the goal to create mastery by building up, so scaffolding, through the other levels? And the answer is yes, although I'm not sure what you mean by levels. So when I'm saying yes, what I mean is that the process is to basically have this very simple set of skills and these simple processes, so the practices and the scientific process and the engineering design process, that we apply over and over and over again to different contexts. And what happens is, as we do that, we master the practices and we master the processes. We also master the content, because what happens is we have to, when we engage that content, things happen. When you put pieces together and you test something, something happens. There's an output, and by quantifying, by capturing data, that output is something we can consider, we can compare, we can analyze, and then we can reflect on what we've created. And so by doing that in many different contexts, and then, so you can think of that September through June, so you're going to transition through sort of physical science, earth science, life science, and then other aspects of physical science with things like energy and circuitry and engineering, so how you actually apply those scientific concepts to solve problems. what you're doing is you're connecting constantly. But as you go from one year to the next, what's happening is that you're going deeper and deeper and deeper. New contexts for the same standards appear. So an example could be if you're thinking about earth science and life science, or we'll just think about life science. There are the ideas of heredity, and so inheritance and traits, but then there's also how those connect to ecosystems and how ecosystems have food chains and food webs, and how weather events and landforms and climate affect the sort of plants and animals that can live in a region, and how any changes in those systems can have become major outcomes. So that's what I mean by going deeper, sort of these different levels. It's a level, different levels within the year, but also from one year to the next. So it's not repeating literal content, but repeating standards in new contexts. And that's really how you get mastery. So let's see if we have any other questions. We have one here. Again, somebody asked about how is it that we were able to, so what resources do we have available and how were we able to get all these resources so quickly with Next Generation Science Standards only being out in 2013. So the resources that we have here at NOADM, and you're welcome to contact Mary Ellen's the best person to contact about this. So the resources we have here at NOADM are next generation aligned curriculum, and it's designed with understanding by design sort of methodology. And what that means is it's derived from the standards. And so there are units that are monthly units, and sometimes they're slightly shorter than a month, depends what grade level. What they are is they're kind of a theme where there's teacher background content and then these different lessons that bring those standards to life in a way that the students can have full responsibility for approaching a problem or a question hands-on. And sort of beginning in 4th grade, they have those blank composition notebooks where they are hypothesis testing or developing prototypes and testing them and really doing the full plan all on their own. Prior to 4th grade, they're still developing plans and carrying those out on their own, but they're a little more facilitated. There are certain things that developmentally really aren't appropriate yet, which we help facilitate. So students may be making a choice about something, and then in other areas, you know, carrying out a procedure and collecting the data, doing a scientific diagram, and forming a conclusion. So with that in mind, so there's that curriculum component, and then what we do is in order to make that something that teachers are able to deliver consistently, or really schools are able to deliver consistently, whether they have new teachers on board or, you know, not, we have all of the materials that basically link up to each of those units, so people don't have to go out and find anything. It's all there for them. It's all prepped. There's no kind of going home and cutting up bottles or things like this. And so it's really, it's designed for by teachers for teachers with that in mind. And it's kit in small numbers for 12 for sort of rural classrooms, all the way up to 30 for more inner city classrooms. And what it does is it's designed to go September through June and also nurture from one year to the next, so that from a student's experience, the definitions that they're hearing, the way science and engineering is being referred to is consistent, so there's no confusion. They can really take the definitions and work with them. So that's what we do here. We also have professional development that we do, which deals with standards, implementation, all of those sort of things. And you're welcome to visit our website, noadm.com. We have a bunch of, actually we have some sample units that you can download there if you'd like, 1st grade through 8th grade, to just sort of see what that looks like. And you're also welcome to connect with us on Facebook or Twitter. We post things, we have a blog. If any of those resources, they're free, if they'd be helpful to you. Let's see if I have one more question in here. Another person asked, is this slideshow going to be available? The slideshow won't be available as a slideshow, but again, the recording will be available to you, and you're welcome to take that recording and, you know, share it with colleagues. If you have a team meeting, you're welcome to do that. We also have other webinars from time to time, and we're looking at having a content-specific series as well this year once school is fully in and people are settled, probably starting in October. So if you are on our list, keep an eye out for that. And otherwise, I greatly thank you for your time. I hope this was helpful. And if you do come up with any other questions, feel free to send those over to me or to Mary Ellen, and we'd be happy to answer those for you. And otherwise, we wish you well for this new school year, and thank you again for your time. Bye-bye.